Kandahar Airfield as Staff Sergeant Maya Chen adjusted her position atop the watchtower for what felt like the 1,000th time in 6 months. The metal grating beneath her knees had worn grooves into her uniform, and the familiar weight of her M24 sniper weapon system had become as natural as breathing. To everyone else on base, she was just another pair of eyes on guard duty, scanning the horizon for threats that rarely materialized in the daylight hours. Maya had grown accustomed to the dismissive glances from the pilots as they strutted past her tower, their flight suits crisp and their confidence radiating like heat waves off the tarmac. She understood their perspective. To them, she was static defense, a necessary but unglamorous component of base security while they soared through hostile skis, engaging enemy fighters and conducting precision strikes that would make headlines back home. What they didn't know was that Maya had graduated top of her class from the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, or that she held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed kill shot in her previous deployment to Iraq, a record she'd never bothered to submit for official recognition. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone with her specialized skills was relegated to what amounted to glorified guard duty. The decision had come down from command after a controversial incident during her last tour, where her refusal to take a shot that would have resulted in civilian casualties had led to heated discussions about her reliability under pressure. The reprimand in her file spoke of hesitation and overthinking, but Maya knew better. She had seen the children playing in the compound's courtyard through her scope, their laughter carrying across the desert air even as enemy combatants moved weapons through the building. The shot she didn't take that day haunted her more than any she had made. Now 6 months into her rotation at Kandahar, Maya had settled into a routine that bordered on meditation. She knew every rock formation within a 2-mile radius, could identify aircraft by their engine sounds before they appeared over the horizon, and had cataloged the daily patterns of local wildlife with the precision of a naturalist. The other guards joked that she could spot a scorpion moving at 1,000 yards, but Maya's attention to detail went far beyond casual observation. She had noticed subtle changes in the local population's behavior over the past weeks. Fewer vendors approaching the base perimeter, children staying closer to their homes, and an almost imperceptible increase in the number of military-aged males moving through the distant village. Her concerns had been documented and passed up the chain of command, but the intelligence reports that came back suggested no imminent threats. The war was winding down, they said. The enemy was in disarray, focused on surviving rather than launching major operations. Maya's reports were filed away with the thousands of others generated daily by soldiers whose job it was to watch and wait. But Maya continued to watch, her instincts honed by years of combat telling her that something was building beyond the visible horizon. The pilots of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing went about their missions with a confidence that came from air superiority and superior technology. Their F-16s and A-10s ruled the skies over Afghanistan, and ground threats were considered minimal in the current operational environment. Colonel James Mitchell, the wing commander, had recently briefed his pilots on the reduced threat posture and the upcoming drawdown of forces. The biggest concerns, according to intelligence briefings, were IEDs on supply routes and the occasional rocket attack, nuisances rather than existential threats. Maya had tried to engage some of the pilots in conversation about her observations, but the difference in rank and the invisible barriers of military hierarchy made such interactions brief and formal. To Captain Sarah Rodriguez, the wing's first female F-16 pilot, Maya was just another enlisted soldier doing her job competently but unremarkably. To Lieutenant Colonel David Park, the squadron's most experienced A-10 pilot, she was background personnel, essential but invisible, like the mechanics who kept their aircraft flying or the cooks who fed them between missions. What none of them realized was that Maya had been tracking something far more sophisticated than the typical insurgent activity. Through weeks of patient observation, she had identified what appeared to be a coordinated surveillance operation targeting the air base. The pattern was subtle. A farmer who appeared in the same field at precisely the same time each morning, always when the first flight of aircraft launched. A shepherd who moved his flock along routes that provided clear sightlines to the runway during peak operational hours. A merchant whose cart broke down with suspicious regularity at positions that offered unobstructed views of aircraft maintenance areas. Maya had documented each observation with the methodical precision that had made her an exceptional sniper, noting times, positions, and photographic evidence when possible. Her reports detailed a level of coordination that suggested professional military training rather than opportunistic insurgent activity. But in an environment where intelligence flowed like water through a sieve, and priorities shifted with each new directive from higher headquarters, her detailed observations were absorbed into the bureaucratic machine without generating the alarm she felt they warranted. The isolation of her position had given Maya time to think, perhaps too much time. She found herself questioning not just the immediate tactical situation, but her role in the larger conflict. The weight of her previous decisions, both the shots taken and those declined, settled on her shoulders like the accumulating dust of the Afghan desert. She had joined the army to serve something greater than herself, to be part of a mission that mattered. But months of watching and waiting, of filing reports that disappeared into the void, had left her feeling disconnected from any meaningful purpose. Her sniper rifle had become both companion and reminder of capabilities unused. Each morning she performed the ritual of cleaning and checking her weapon, maintaining the muscle memory and mental discipline that had once made her deadly effective. The M24's familiar weight and the precision of its mechanisms represented a time when her skills had direct and measurable impact. Now that same precision was applied to counting vehicles, cataloging suspicious behavior, and filing reports that no one seemed to read. As the Afghan sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the base, Maya settled into another day of observation and vigilance. She had no way of knowing that the patterns she had been tracking were about to converge into a threat unlike anything Kandahar airfield had faced. The enemy had been patient, professional, and precise in their planning. They had studied the base's routines, identified its vulnerabilities, and positioned assets with the same methodical care that Maya applied to her own observations. The morning would soon transform from routine guard duty into a moment that would test every skill she had acquired over years of training and combat. The pilots who dismissed her as mere perimeter security would discover that the quiet soldier in the watchtower possessed capabilities that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Maya's journey from overlooked guard to critical asset was about to begin, triggered by a threat that only her trained eye had the patience and skill to identify. The first sign that this day would be different came at 8:47 hours, when Maya's trained eye caught something that made her blood run cold. Through her scope, she watched as the familiar farmer in the distant field, the one whose pattern she had been tracking for weeks, suddenly abandoned his morning routine. Instead of tending to his crops, he was now crouched behind a low stone wall, and the metallic glint Maya caught wasn't from farming tools. It was the unmistakable reflection of optical equipment, and from his position, he had a perfect view of the runway where the morning's first flight was preparing for takeoff. But what truly sent adrenaline coursing through Maya's veins was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. As she systematically scanned the perimeter through her scope, the pattern she had been documenting for weeks suddenly crystallized into a coordinated attack formation. The shepherd, with his suspicious timing, was positioned on elevated ground to the northeast, his flock scattered as he focused intently on something in his hands. The merchant whose cart had broken down so frequently was now stationary at a position that provided overwatch of the aircraft maintenance hangars. They weren't random observers. They were a trained reconnaissance team, and they were all focused on the same target. Maya's radio crackled to life with routine communications as the first flight of F-16s began their pre-flight checks. Captain Sarah Rodriguez's voice came through clearly as she ran through her system's checklist, unaware that hostile eyes were tracking her every movement. The irony struck Maya with painful clarity. Here was the pilot she had tried to warn about increased surveillance, going through her routine completely oblivious to the crosshairs that were metaphorically centered on her aircraft. The twist that changed everything came when Maya realized the true scope of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just surveillance or reconnaissance. It was target acquisition for something much larger. Through her scope, she could see that each of the positioned observers was holding communication equipment, and they were all oriented not just toward the runway, but toward a specific section of sky to the south. Maya's enhanced optics allowed her to detect what the naked eye would miss: the barely perceptible contrail of an aircraft approaching from beyond the mountain range, flying at an altitude and trajectory that suggested hostile intent. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The weeks of surveillance hadn't been random intelligence gathering. They had been preparation for a precision strike using a surface-to-air missile system. The observers were forward spotters, providing real-time targeting data to a launch platform positioned beyond the visual range of base defenses. The approaching contrail belonged to an aircraft that had launched from outside Afghan airspace, likely carrying advanced weaponry that could devastate the entire air wing before anyone knew they were under attack. Maya's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she switched her radio to the emergency frequency, but when she keyed the microphone, nothing but static came through. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The communication jamming that she had attributed to atmospheric conditions over the past few days hadn't been natural phenomena. It had been deliberate electronic warfare preparation, designed to isolate the base at the moment of attack. The enemy had been more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, and they had planned this operation with military precision that rivaled anything the U.S. forces could execute. The emotional weight of the moment crashed over Maya as she understood that she was the only person on base who recognized the immediate threat. All of her reports, all of her careful documentation, all of her attempts to raise concerns had been insufficient to prevent this moment. Now, with communications compromised and the attack imminent, she was faced with a choice that would define not just her career, but potentially the lives of hundreds of personnel on the base. Through her scope, Maya could see Captain Rodriguez climbing into her F-16, her pre-flight routine proceeding normally as ground crews made final preparations for launch. Lieutenant Colonel Park was visible near his A-10, reviewing mission briefings with his wingman, both pilots completely unaware that they were about to become targets in a precisely orchestrated ambush. The irony was devastating. The very pilots who had dismissed her as insignificant guard duty were now depending on her training and instincts for their survival, even though they didn't know it. Maya's military training had taught her to follow protocols, to work within the chain of command, to trust in the systems and procedures that kept military operations functioning. But all of those systems had failed in this moment. The intelligence apparatus had missed the threat, communications were compromised, and the attack was minutes from execution. The only thing standing between a successful enemy operation and the destruction of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing was a single soldier in a watchtower who had been relegated to what everyone considered the least important job on base. The approaching aircraft was now visible to Maya's naked eye, a small speck against the morning sky that was growing larger with each passing second. Her training kicked in as she began calculating range, wind speed, and trajectory, but this wasn't a typical sniper engagement. The target was airborne, moving at high speed, and the stakes were unlike anything she had faced in her career. A missed shot wouldn't just mean mission failure. It would mean watching helplessly as the enemy achieved total surprise against an unsuspecting air wing. Maya's scope settled on the forward observer in the field, the one whose metallic equipment glint had first caught her attention. Through her enhanced optics, she could see him speaking rapidly into a communication device, his body language suggesting the final coordination phase of the attack. His position was approximately 800 meters from her location, well within her demonstrated capabilities, but complicated by the need for absolute precision. If she eliminated him, she would disrupt the targeting coordination, but the other observers would likely compensate, and the approaching aircraft might proceed with the attack using pre-programmed coordinates. The weight of command responsibility settled on Maya's shoulders as she realized that her next decision would determine the outcome of an engagement that could reshape the tactical situation in the entire region. She was no longer just a soldier following orders. She had become the tactical commander of a defensive action that no one else knew was taking place. Every instinct honed through years of combat experience was telling her to engage, but the same instincts that had saved civilian lives in Iraq now forced her to consider the broader implications of her actions. As the hostile aircraft closed to within what Maya estimated as weapons range, she made the calculation that would define her legacy. The forward observer was her primary target, but the real threat was the approaching aircraft. If she could disrupt the coordination between the ground spotters and the airborne platform at the critical moment of weapons release, she might force the enemy pilot to abort or miss the target entirely. It would require timing that measured success in fractions of seconds, and there would be no opportunity for a follow-up shot. Maya's breathing steadied as she entered the zone of absolute focus that separated exceptional snipers from merely competent marksmen. The world narrowed to the specific point where her crosshairs intersected with the target, and every external distraction faded into insignificance. This was the moment that all of her training, all of her experience, and all of her controversial decisions had been preparing her for. The soldier who had been dismissed as guard duty was about to prove that sometimes the most critical battles are fought by those who see threats that others miss. The shot that changed everything came at 8:51 hours, with Captain Rodriguez's F-16 engines spooling up for takeoff just 400 meters away. Maya's finger found the familiar curve of her trigger as she watched the forward observer raise what she now recognized as a laser designator toward the runway. The mathematics of the shot were complex, not just accounting for distance, wind, and bullet drop, but timing the impact to coincide with the critical moment when the enemy aircraft would be acquiring its target. Maya had one chance to sever the coordination between ground and air, and failure meant watching the air wing's most experienced pilots die in balls of fire on the tarmac. The M-24's report echoed across the base like thunder, but Maya was already tracking her next target before the sound waves reached the control tower. Through her scope, she watched the forward observer collapse behind the stone wall, his laser designator spinning away across the rocky ground. But her satisfaction lasted only seconds. The approaching enemy aircraft was now clearly visible, and its pilot was proceeding with what appeared to be a pre-programmed attack run despite the loss of ground coordination. What happened next would haunt Maya's dreams for years to come, but also cement her reputation as one of the most decisive soldiers in modern combat. As she swung her rifle toward the second observer position, Maya caught sight of something that made her heart stop, a small figure running across the field between her position and the enemy spotter. It was a child, no more than 8 years old, who had apparently been playing near the irrigation channels when the shooting started. The boy was running directly into Maya's line of fire, his path intersecting with her target at exactly the moment she needed to take her second shot. The memory of her previous deployment flooded back in an instant. The compound in Iraq, the children in the courtyard, the shot she hadn't taken that had cost her the respect of her unit but saved innocent lives. Now, 3 years later and half a world away, she was facing the same impossible choice, but this time the stakes were exponentially higher. If she held her fire to protect the child, the second observer would continue coordinating the attack, and Captain Rodriguez's aircraft would likely be destroyed on takeoff. If she took the shot with the child in the danger zone, she might save the air wing but destroy her own soul. The approaching enemy aircraft was now close enough that Maya could identify it through her scope. A modified Su-25 Frogfoot, heavily armed and flying at an altitude that put it just above the effective range of the base's defensive systems. Its pilot was maintaining course and speed for an attack run that would commence within 90 seconds, regardless of whether ground coordination was available. Maya realized that her shot on the first observer had bought time but not safety, and the window for effective defensive action was closing rapidly. Maya's training screamed at her to take the shot. Military doctrine was clear about acceptable collateral damage in defense of critical assets. The mathematics were simple. One child's life weighed against the potential loss of dozens of pilots, hundreds of ground personnel, and military assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Any reasonable tactical commander would authorize the engagement without hesitation. But Maya was no longer just following orders or doctrine. She was making choices that would define who she was as both a soldier and a human being. The child stumbled and fell in the irrigation ditch, directly between Maya and her target. Through her scope, she could see his face clearly, terror and confusion as he tried to understand why the quiet morning had suddenly erupted in gunfire and shouting. The second observer was now clearly visible above him, adjusting what appeared to be a backup targeting system while speaking urgently into his radio. Maya's crosshairs wavered between the legitimate military target and the innocent child, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Time dilated as Maya's mind processed options with the speed that comes from years of combat experience. She could wait for the child to clear her line of fire, but that would give the observer time to complete his targeting sequence. She could attempt a precision shot that avoided the child but had lower probability of stopping the threat. She could shift to the third observer position, but that would require precious seconds to reacquire and might not prevent the immediate attack. Every option carried catastrophic risks, and the clock was measured in heartbeats rather than minutes. The twist that resolved Maya's dilemma came from an unexpected source: her own reputation for precision. The child in the irrigation ditch looked up at her watchtower, and something in his young face suggested he understood that the soldier above was trying to protect rather than threaten him. With a maturity that seemed impossible for his age, the boy rolled deeper into the ditch, clearing Maya's line of fire while using the concrete irrigation channel for protection from both her shot and potential ricochets. Maya's second shot came without conscious thought, her muscle memory and training taking over while her conscious mind was still processing the child's unexpected cooperation. The bullet traveled 650 meters in less than a second, striking the second observer center mass as he attempted to lock onto Captain Rodriguez's aircraft. The impact sent his targeting equipment spinning into the rocks, and Maya watched through her scope as the enemy coordination network collapsed into chaos. But the approaching Su-25 was now entering its attack run, and Maya realized that eliminating the ground spotters had not eliminated the threat. The enemy pilot was proceeding with a visual attack, using the clearly visible runway and aircraft as navigation points for what appeared to be a conventional bombing run. Maya's defensive actions had degraded the attack's precision, but had not prevented it entirely, and she was about to watch helplessly as the enemy aircraft released its ordnance against her base. The emotional weight of the moment was overwhelming. Maya had made the right choice about the child, had successfully eliminated 2/3 of the enemy spotting network, and had maintained her personal integrity under impossible pressure. But it might not be enough to prevent the catastrophe she had been trying to stop. As she watched the enemy aircraft's final approach, Maya felt the familiar sensation of being one soldier against forces too large for any individual to influence. Then Maya remembered something from her advanced sniper training that changed everything: a technique called indirect engagement that involved using precision rifle fire not to directly eliminate threats, but to create tactical conditions that forced enemy actions into predictable patterns. If she couldn't stop the Su-25 attack directly, perhaps she could influence its execution in ways that reduced its effectiveness. Maya shifted her aim to the third observer position, but instead of targeting the spotter himself, she focused on the communication equipment he was using to coordinate with the approaching aircraft. Her third shot shattered the radio antenna at 800 meters, severing the final link between ground and air coordination. The enemy pilot was now flying blind, forced to rely entirely on visual navigation and his own judgment about target identification and weapons release timing. The Su-25 attack came exactly as Maya had predicted. The pilot, deprived of ground coordination and uncertain about his target identification, released his ordnance early and wide of the intended target. The explosions that erupted across the airfield were spectacular but largely ineffective, destroying empty hardstand areas and supply buildings rather than operational aircraft or personnel facilities. Captain Rodriguez's F-16 completed its takeoff roll unharmed, climbing into the morning sky as debris from the missed attack rained down on vacant concrete. Maya's actions had transformed what should have been a devastating enemy success into a costly failure that exposed their operational capabilities without achieving their strategic objectives. The pilots who had dismissed her as insignificant guard duty were now climbing into the sky alive and unharmed, completely unaware that their survival had depended on the precision and judgment of the soldier they had considered beneath their notice. The air wing would fly again, the mission would continue, and the war would proceed, all because one person had been willing to see threats that others missed and take actions that others wouldn't consider. The aftermath of what would later be classified as the Kandahar incident unfolded with the bureaucratic machinery that Maya had come to expect from military operations, but with a twist that she never could have anticipated. Within hours of the failed attack, intelligence analysts were poring over satellite footage, communications intercepts, and battle damage assessments, trying to understand how a sophisticated enemy operation had been detected and neutralized by a single soldier whose previous reports had been largely ignored. The official investigation would take weeks, but the immediate questions were both simpler and more complex than anyone expected. Colonel James Mitchell's first visit to Maya's watchtower came 12 hours after the attack, when the base had returned to something approaching normal operations, and the full scope of what had transpired was beginning to emerge. Maya had remained at her post throughout the day, documenting the aftermath with the same methodical precision she had applied to identifying the initial threat. When the wing commander climbed the narrow stairs to her observation position, Maya expected the standard debriefing that followed any significant incident. What she received instead was something that would fundamentally alter her relationship with everyone on base. "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Mitchell began, his voice carrying a weight that Maya had never heard directed toward her before. "I need you to walk me through everything you observed, everything you documented, and everything you decided. Because according to our analysts, you just prevented the most sophisticated attack on U.S. air assets since the beginning of this conflict, and you did it alone, without orders, and using intelligence that our entire network somehow missed." The recognition that Maya had craved throughout her deployment came not as validation, but as a burden that she struggled to process. As she recounted her weeks of observations, her attempts to raise concerns through proper channels, and the split-second decisions that had saved the air wing, Maya realized that her actions had exposed fundamental failures in the intelligence and command systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this type of surprise attack. Her success was simultaneously a vindication of her skills and an indictment of the military bureaucracy that had dismissed her warnings. Captain Sarah Rodriguez's visit came 2 days later, after the initial shock of learning how close she had come to death had given way to a need to understand the person who had saved her life. Maya was cleaning her rifle when the pilot climbed into the watchtower, still wearing her flight suit and carrying the weight of someone who had discovered that her assumptions about military hierarchy and competence were dangerously flawed. "I owe you my life," Captain Rodriguez said without preamble, her usual confidence replaced by something Maya had never seen from any of the pilots, humility mixed with genuine gratitude. "I owe you an apology too. I saw you up here every day for 6 months, and I never once considered that you might be the most important person on this base. I never asked your name, never acknowledged your service, never thought about what you were actually doing while I was focused on my own missions." The conversation that followed would become the foundation for a friendship that transcended rank and service branch. But more importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how the air wing understood the interconnected nature of their security. Maya's actions had demonstrated that the most critical intelligence often came not from sophisticated technical systems, but from human observation, patience, and the willingness to trust one's own judgment even when it contradicted official assessments. The transformation in Maya's role came with unexpected consequences that revealed the complex politics of military recognition. Her immediate promotion to Sergeant First Class was accompanied by assignment to a newly created position as Tactical Observations Specialist, a role that acknowledged her unique capabilities while avoiding the uncomfortable questions about why those capabilities had been underutilized for so long. The commendation for her actions was classified at a level that prevented public recognition, but within the military intelligence community, Maya's name became synonymous with the kind of ground truth observation that technical systems couldn't replicate. But the most profound change was in Maya herself. The weight of having made life-and-death decisions for hundreds of people, combined with the knowledge that her moral choices had proven both correct and effective, gave her a confidence that she had never possessed before. The soldier who had questioned her own judgment and struggled with the isolation of her position had been replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought by individuals who refuse to accept that they are powerless to influence events. The investigation into how the enemy had managed to coordinate such a sophisticated attack revealed disturbing truths about intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, and the dangerous assumption that reduced threat levels meant eliminated threats. Maya's detailed documentation became the foundation for a comprehensive review of base security procedures, and her recommendations for improving observation and reporting protocols were implemented across the theater of operations. The quiet soldier who had been relegated to guard duty had become an inadvertent architect of improved defensive doctrine. 6 months later, when Maya's deployment ended and she prepared to return to the United States, the send-off ceremony at Kandahar Airfield bore no resemblance to the anonymous arrival that had brought her to Afghanistan. The pilots of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing had insisted on a formal recognition ceremony, despite the classified nature of her actions. Captain Rodriguez, now promoted to major, presented Maya with a plaque that read simply, "To the Guardian in the Tower, thank you for seeing what others missed." A child from the irrigation ditch was there too, brought by his grateful father who had learned from village elders about the American soldier who had risked her own mission to protect his son. The boy, whose name Maya learned was Ahmad, presented her with a small carved wooden bird that his grandfather had made. The gift represented something that no military decoration could capture: the recognition that true courage sometimes means choosing the harder path, even when easier options would be tactically justified. Maya's return to the United States brought offers for advanced training, special assignments, and career opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. But more importantly, it brought the knowledge that she had proven to herself and others that individual action could still make a difference in a world that often seemed too complex for any one person to influence. The controversial decisions that had once marked her as unreliable had become the foundation for a reputation built on moral courage and tactical excellence. The final twist in Maya's story came not in the form of official recognition or career advancement, but in a letter that arrived 6 months after her return from Afghanistan. It was from Ahmad's father, written in careful English and accompanied by a photograph of his son starting his first day of school. The letter thanked Maya not just for protecting his child during the attack, but for showing him that there were people in the world who would risk everything to protect those who could not protect themselves. "My son tells everyone about the American soldier who could have hurt him but chose to keep him safe instead," the letter read. "He says he wants to grow up to be someone who protects others the way you protected him. You saved more than his life that day. You saved his faith in the goodness of people." Maya kept that letter in the same folder as her commendations and performance reviews, but she knew which document truly measured the value of her service. The soldier who had believed she was just guard duty had discovered that sometimes the most important victories are won not by those who seek glory, but by those who are willing to stand watch in the quiet hours, seeing threats that others miss and making choices that others wouldn't make. Her sniper round had indeed saved the air wing, but perhaps more importantly, her courage had saved something even more precious: the possibility that individual conscience and professional skill could still triumph over systems too large and bureaucratic to respond to threats that required human judgment to detect and human courage to defeat.